debate.
I call the honourable member Michael Woodhouse.
Speaker, and in the previous call I heard Mr Williams interjecting that the Auckland Super City legislation was National's fault. And well, actually, let's just think about the consequences of that, because certainly North Shore's loss is Parliament's gain, isn't it? Because were it not for the fact that that legislation was passed, we wouldn't have the gracing of the presence of Mr Williams in this House, waxing lyrical with such great lines as spray and walk away. He is indeed, Mr Speaker, the gift that keeps on giving. And that's been the sort of the debate, isn't it? One of the more eloquent members of the Labour caucus described Mr English's speech as pure bollocks. Well, I think that is a measure of the sort of language that has been coming out of the Labour Party caucus in the last 24 hours. Very unfortunate, but people are listening. But what confuses me the most, Mr Speaker, is how the Labour Party claims they understand the importance of an export-led open economy with our trading partners, and then turns around and says the things that happen in Europe can't matter to us. Why is the government always blaming Europe for our woes? Well, actually we're not. They are simply an environmental variable. But it is worth, I think, reflecting on the sorts of things that trading nations around the world are having to do, including the very significant austerity measures that are being taken by those economies. In the UK, they are facing cuts in nursing staff in their NHS hospitals of up to 20%. As part of a plan to reduce public sector workers by nearly 750,000. I mean, that's about a third of our workforce, and they're having to cut it as part of their austerity measures. We don't need to remind the House of what is going on in Greece and the very, very real risk that the contagion effect of the European banks not continuing to support that economy, and it was certainly a relief last weekend when some form of common sense prevailed by the voters of Europe. Spain, a very large debt challenge and one of our largest kiwi fruit markets. So it's simply not possible to say that to pretend that we're an open trading nation and then not say that those things matter to this economy. Because our tradable sector was in recession for years before National took the Treasury benches back, Mr Speaker, and we faced 10 years of deficits. Unemployment rates targeted to achieve 7.5%, inflation already 5.1% when we came to office, forecast to go to nearly 6%, and we stayed below that despite increasing GST, and interest rates at an overcooked 8% or so, now down to a much more moderate level. And yet, still there is criticism from members on the other side for setting targets. Well, I want to compare those targets with the rhetoric, or as Dr Clark said last night, the rhetoric. We have a plethora of rhetoric from the other side of the House. And remember what those rhetoric comments were from the Labour government. Knowledge economy. Remember the knowledge economy. And the tide went out on the knowledge wave, didn't it? Remember, this is the one that I really like, the zero carbon economy. Zero carbon, and yet under a Labour Green government, carbon emissions went through the roof. We lost 35,000 hectares of trees. What else do we have? Closing the gaps. Remember closing the gaps? The gaps widened. And Mr Speaker, one of the reasons is because while they talked in rhetoric, as Dr Clark would say, not a single target was set. In the best of economic times, not a single target was met. And you know the best thing about not setting target? You don't have to meet it. One doesn't have to meet it. There's no measure of failure. Well, I think the Prime Minister and his Cabinet have set very ambitious and brave targets. They are putting themselves out there, and I think this is a very, very significant moment for politics in New Zealand, because it's an edgy business, but it does definitely give some meaning to the substance of the policies that we are debating in this House and implementing. And one of them, of course, was the mixed ownership model. And the Labour Party will say, well, we learnt from our mistakes in the 1980s. And it is true. They learnt. Actually, so did the National Government. Because we would never sneak in asset sales under the radar of an electoral mandate as they did in the 1980s. We'd never sell 100%. We'd never do it to a single purchaser, and we'd never do it under urgency, Mr Speaker. This was very fair, it was well signalled, it went through Select Committee, and it had a mandate, and I think that's a very, very good way to do it. This government learned.
called. Cheers.
I can read the member's lips. It'll have to be louder. But anyway, I'll call the honourable member Dennis O'Rourke.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.